The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk, the Bronx's flagship television talk show. The phones are open and we welcome your input into the dialogue. Call in at 718-960-7241. You can also email comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com and we'll read those on the air during a future program. Well, the Christmas Day diffusion of a terrorist bomb plot aboard an airline in Detroit has renewed calls for tighter security in our airports, and the FAA and TSA are trying to comply. But some of the tactics include body scanning, which is not making everyone happy. Also, new measures are effective, and they're trying to be effective, but are there still holes in our security in our airports? That's our question tonight. Feel free to call in and share some of your own experiences with us if you'd like. We've got two experts in the studio, a security expert and counterterrorism consultant who actually caught a suicide bomber in the act and thwarted the attempt a little while back. He's a real hero. Please join me in welcoming Albert Timmon to BronxTalk. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
And also the newly named chairman in the Monroe College School of Criminal Justice. He too is a hero, a former NYPD detective. And thank you so much, Wilfred Pinkney, for joining us. We appreciate you, for being with us tonight. Gentlemen, a lot to talk about, and I threw that out there, Albert, and I hadn't really heard the story, and I thought we'd save it for the show. So what did happen when you thwarted a suicide bomber and defused the attempt?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to keep it short as I can.
We'll have a half hour.
Well, it was, I believe it was January 2002 when we got information. I was still in the Israeli police, a certain unit that was tasked with this specific type of missions back then to thwart or arrest or stop the wave of terrorism. Right. And one of our tasks were to actually catch a suicide bomber. The specific mission was to catch him alive if possible, and it took a lot of planning to do that. The time that we didn't have to do the planning, everything was in a little bit of a roll. We call it as a roll. As it happens, we are on the job and we get the information second by second what happens. We were the arrest team. I was in charge of the arrest team. I was the head of the arrest team. It was my call only how to make the arrest. Every communication in the area was shut down because we wanted to put the terrorist himself without any suspicion that we're on his tail.
You had already identified who he was?
We already got the information who he was. We already had the general idea where he's going to detonate the explosive charge, and we were already actually tailing him. A part of our team was tailing him, and we were about to get more information as we do our online progressive planning for the actual arrest.
Right.
Something happening.
Let's cut to the chase and get right to
something happened in between, and we lost contact with the team, and I just was a little bit more concerned with the guy approaching the target and detonating before we can do anything else. So I decided to advance the team to the point that we make the arrest and we make it is the safest way that we can. The only information that we got that he has an explosive charge. We wasn't sure that he picked it up or he was wearing it already, but we knew that he's advancing to the final point. At this point, we broke every communication because my concern was if we have a radio frequency that can detonate the charge itself, and any move that we going to do is going to let him know that we're on his tail, and he's going to do like a
So you simply, attacked,
jumped
him?
We averted
I don't know what the technical term is.
we averted the vehicle that he was in. He was mobile in a vehicle that was supposed to drop him at the drop zone. So from there, he's supposed to walk and detonate.
Right.
We averted that vehicle in a specific spot without his ability to understand that this is what we're doing. We were undercover. He didn't know who's coming, that we're actually in the act of the arrest. And he was pulled out of the car without being, and it took a few seconds. He was on the ground, a few fingers broken, but he survived.
And lives saved, obviously. And of course, you don't really know where his detonator is, or you're going to really try to make sure.
The detonator, the MO of the modus operandi was that he has everything set up for the explosive, and all he has to do is just to press a button. So
you had to catch him before he did that.
Yes.
Well, thank you on behalf of humanity that you did that. Let's get to the point here.
Sure.
This bombing attempt was thwarted. It seemed to expose, even at this late date after 2001 and 9/11, a number of holes in our security. There have been a number of things tried to shore up the holes. Are you satisfied that right now we've done what we could do to keep not only Americans, but everybody secure in our airports?
Absolutely not. Absolutely. That would be an understatement, actually, because I think that the last attempt that we had in December 2009, as we know it as the underpants bomber, on the airplane.
I wish it were funny.
Like the rest of us, but I think that this exposes one of the biggest faults that we cannot live with after 9/11 already happened so many years ago, and so many promises were made, and so many dollars were spent on heightening and tightening the security, and so many statements by so many people said that we're more secure today than ever before.
Right.
And I think that first of all, in security, you have to be honest with yourself and with the people that you're
So where are the holes? Where's the biggest hole?
Well, where should I start?
The biggest one.
The biggest one is I would say, the biggest one is information sharing. That would be the first one that I would pinpoint if I would have a list to go by.
And this was, in other words, CIA had information that maybe they didn't communicate to the TSA, which ultimately didn't get to the no-fly list.
Exactly. In not necessarily in this order, but there's a big loophole in how we communicate between agencies, how information itself being processed.
Professor Pinckney, let's talk from the people on the ground, so to speak. If you're a police officer or somebody in an official capacity, are you concerned about the same kind of thing?
Definitely. I mean, information sharing is a concern, and I think on our end here in America, the biggest concern is that you have multiple agencies responsible for jurisdiction of the airports. One of the problems is in our country that airports can either have a dedicated police force, or they can have an airport covered by a police force as part of their ordinary patrol functions. We have the Transportation Security Administration, obviously, here in our country that's responsible for the security at airports, but their powers are kind of limited. They have no authority to detain anyone. They basically are an administrative agency that's enforcing administrative rules by the FAA. So while they are screening people, and screening people is obviously important, as he'll tell you, to ensure that they pose no risk, if we look at being proactive beyond that, that's where the problem comes.
So New York airports, we assume, are well covered by the TSA, et cetera, but your suggestion is that local police forces in Wichita, Kansas, or somewhere else are really responsible for those airports, and maybe they don't have the expertise that maybe the TSA or other larger agencies have.
Well, possibly, and even here in New York, obviously, we have the Port Authority Police, Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and they're responsible for security or enforcement at the airports, enforcement of laws at the airport, in addition to TSA. And the benefit there is that you have an agency that's trained in these actual security provision. So they know, like this gentleman will tell you, that it's important to check IDs and do things like that.
But a chain as strong as its weakest link. You can have the greatest security in the New York City airport, but take a small airport, whether it be in this country or another country, and if that's managed by a local police force or not as well trained, well, certainly if I'm diabolical enough to want to do it, that's where I'm going to try and get into the system.
Of course.
Obviously. Let's go a little further, okay? We know about the communication, or lack of communication. What about this notion of jurisdiction for the TSA? Is this a problem?
It poses a problem because every little aspect is just another layer of what we're trying to achieve in terms of final product of security. Because if we're now trying to control a specific area, who is responsible for it? Is that the NYPD and or the TSA? Port Authority. Who reports to whom? Who is in charge?
So who should be making this decision? In other words, does the president have to draw? Because it sounds to me like this is a systemic problem much more than an individual, well, let's change a couple of rules problem.
Absolutely, it's a systemic problem.
Who should step up to the plate and say, you know what, we're gonna handle this differently?
Well, I'll just go from my end because in Israel it's very simple. We have one, person in charge, which has to report to the upper echelon that is in charge over him. So that will create a systematic report system or liability system who take responsibility when stuff like that happen.
Right.
So,
but here you could have half a dozen people, whether it be the president or Congress, or then of course people, heads of agency, whether it be Homeland Security, TSA, FAA, all the way down to the local police force.
Exactly, and
right.
that's a problem because it's multi agencies, a lot of different training types of training, a lot of different types of responsibilities.
So here we're talking about large systemic issues, and yet the response is, and I don't know whether it's done just to make the public think we're safer or that kind of thing, but what basically happened, they said, well, you can't get up in the last hour of a flight. Carry-ons in the last hour of a flight, you can't access those. How effective are those measures?
Well, whenever there's a big, gap between the base and the head, there always will come with plaster. I call it the plaster, solutions for a big wound.
Well, this is what I was saying. That are these effective?
It can be some effective to some extent, but if someone is determined to blow up an airplane or to hijack an airplane, with all the faults that we've seen so far, those small restrictions will not stop him. If he's dedicated and he has what it takes to make it happen.
We saw with the shoe bomber that he came up with something, so then all of a sudden we take off our shoes now in the airport. And we saw with this gentleman, that he tried to detonate it at the end of the flight, so all of a sudden we restrict movement at the end of the flight. But it sounds like your analysis of this is that these are larger issues and we're not going to, because eventually they'll just figure out how to maneuver a little bit differently.
We're avoiding the biggest problem, which we have to look in ourselves, in our agencies, and see what we're doing wrong, why we're not catching those attempts beforehand. Because if I'm catching a person inside the airplane, that's too late for us.
I want to take some calls. I'm going to ask you one question just before we get to that. Do you get the sense that the commitment is there? Is this a financial thing or is this a management concept?
Well, it's because every question has so many answers, and it's not only one answer that can answer all the question. But I'll try to give it the best shot because it's a combination of all. When you see the situation, and I'm again referring back to the situation in Israel, budget is allocated specifically to mission specific, which is airport security. Cannot be spent on something else if you get that budget. And the agency that gets the budget has to prove how they spend it and to show the spend of the budget. 80% of it will go to training, and that's the most beneficial type of as you go for your dollar.
Sure. Professor Pinkney, let's talk about training. We're doing a good job, we're doing a bad job. Evaluate how we're doing with training the personnel who are responsible at our airports?
I think we're doing a good job. I think the question is how many people are trained effectively. And I also think it goes to what people feel is their stature. Do people feel like they're professionals? Do you feel like this is, what I'm doing is important?
In other words, if you're a TSA official of some sort.
Definitely a TSA official, or even a uniformed Port Authority cop who's just standing in a terminal somewhere. You know, it's sort of like, I guess I'm a sports guy, so if you're in a football game and you're on the line and you're in the middle of the play, you may feel like you're important, but if you're a secondary guy and they never throw a pass, or what's the importance of my role? But there is an importance because, like he'll tell you, I mean, the people who are doing the least are able to do the most.
And if you are, going back to my idea about the chain as strong as its weakest link, if you are the one person who's kind of not paying attention or in essence punching the clock in this job, your commitment is not there, that's the hole.
Yes.
All right, let's go to the telephone. Ricky from Marshall Lewis with us. Hello, Ricky. Nice to have you with us.
Hi, Gary. This is interesting. I travel a lot to Malaysia, and apparently every time I come back to Malaysia, my name sets off a red flag. I get stopped off at the immigration department, and apparently I get detained for about 45 minutes.
Really? Now, why is that? Is your name there?
Every time.
Do we know why that is? Do you have a particular look? Is it the gun belt you're wearing?
My name sets off a red flag, Ricardo Martinez. But the interesting part about it is that the guy says that they can't tell me why they stopping me. They can't tell me any information, but I have to get stopped every time.
Very, very interesting.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Also, I have one more question.
Sure, go ahead, ask it, and then we'll...
The second question is, these X-ray machines, I was told they go for about close to 250,000, 300,000, these X-ray machines.
Okay, we're talking about the body scan machines.
Yes.
That'll be the next thing.
And I was also told that people with pacemakers shouldn't be going into these machines.
Okay. We're going to review all those things. Let's do one. Thank you so much, Ricky. Very, very interesting. And it opens up a whole can of worms because the whole notion of if Gary Axelbank's name is there, and I don't know that there's another Gary Axelbank, but because it's kind of an unusual name, but if there are others and somebody is on that list, I'm getting detained and have my rights as a taxpayer and a law-abiding citizen been infringed upon.
I'm not sure if his name is on the no-fly list and this is why he's being detained, but I would be certain that if he flies off to Indonesia and Malaysia, which are considered by the U.S. as a potential high threat for the U.S. in terms of basis for terrorism,
right?
The probability that he will be detained or held, for further questioning, is for actually to see if he's being exploited by someone, recruited by someone, spoke with someone.
So it may not necessarily be his name, it's the fact that he's coming from that country?
Yes.
Very, very interesting. Well, let's get to the civil liberties question. Is this too much? Is this unfair to this law-abiding citizen who travels to a country? We didn't ask him why he does his business there. Assuming it's business, maybe it's family. Is it too far? Is it going too far?
It's a good question. And I don't know, obviously there's many questions to add on to that. But if you look at security versus liberty, I mean, your freedom to be secure in your persons and your freedom to live your life here in the United States does depend on your ability to travel safely. And it is extended from this country for American citizens, on airplanes and traveling abroad. So while it may appear to be at first glance a breach of, our civil liberties, you have to look at the ultimate goal. I mean, those liberties aren't just for us individually, they're for us also as a country. So I think that discussion will go on. I think it should go on for a long time, whether it is, but I think we do have to look at it beyond personal inconveniences.
Well, now let's go to the larger question, this idea of body scans. The first question is this an effective method, or is it, as you say, a Band-Aid or a piece of plaster putting over a hole that's a much larger one?
Well, the body scanners are great machines to begin with. Technologically, development, they can achieve a lot.
Such as? Something that a metal detector or the other kinds of scans that we use now don't do.
They are. We're talking about the full body scanning machine, right?
Right.
they have the ability to see things which are minute, which body scanners and handheld scanners cannot detect, and we can visually see them. So, and that goes to the next step. The operator has to have a lot of information and training, specifically how to detect. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be only as an assistant tool, not necessarily the main tool that stops, or depending on this tool only. We have to make sure that the people behind this device know how to connect the dots.
Given the expense, and I don't have the number in front of me, but we'll assume the phone caller was somewhat accurate, if it costs $250,000, is it worth the expense, which would be considerable? And of course, if you do it in one place but not in another, there's almost no point to it. So number one, the expense, and number two, considering the civil liberty question, is it worth it to go that route? As if the United States government would hire you, would you say, or the TSA would hire you, would you say, yes, it's worth it, let's put these in and let's do it everywhere?
Depends on how much I have in this company invested. But to be honest, I think that every tool is just a tool, and we have to address the issue of being more proactive with what we want to achieve, not what the machine will achieve. And the problem is that we're looking at technology more than training, and this is the balance that we're missing out big time here in the United States. In Israel, we don't have $250,000 to put like on 60, 80, 100 machines. So the budget is very limited. So we have to compromise with training.
And training for?
For questioning, profiling, which is a very bad context word here in the United States, because it has to do with racial profiling. Mm-hmm. But we don't do racial profiling, we do security profiling, which is behavioral profiling. We're looking for the dots that are awkward, not the nationality of the person. And that's something that we need to change here also in the thinking of the decision makers.
I'm just practically, without asking the question, it just opens up so many of the issues, whether, number one, if you're a person who doesn't like the idea of them looking through everything, through your clothes, in essence, like an x-ray machine of some sort. And then, of course, the second question about the profiling. So let's start with number one, as far as the civil liberty question. What if you object to the fact that, and you're a law-abiding person, but you say, you know what, that's really an invasion of my privacy?
I would think people would have a right to reject, and the caller brings up a good point also, in addition to medical conditions. So now you think of the cost of getting this type of scanning done, but now you can't scan people, because certain people, because of liabilities, or because someone says, I don't want to do it, and they opt for a more intrusive, just regular body search. So now you're spending all this money on a machine that you don't actually use, and like he says, you make a good point, you're relying on the machine instead of, do we let our guard down because we get all this technology and we depend on the technology instead of thinking of old-fashioned
And this whole idea of racial profiling, so many Muslim people and Arabic people with similar names just simply get flagged and detained and frankly harassed. On the other hand, of course, we all want to be safe. I'm assuming you buy into what Mr. Timon is saying about making sure that the people are trained properly to use this as much as they'll use an X-ray.
I agree. I mean, because you don't just want to stop someone necessarily because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or religion in the area of the world that they're traveling from, because we would stop everyone, I think.
Absolutely.
And I've been stopped coming from certain areas of the world, traveling by myself.
Right.
So, yes, you don't want to, you have to rely on just intelligent, common sense observations of, of security and experiences that you've had.
Can we do that in this country?
Of course we can. Of course we can. I mean, it comes to a larger question, political pressure and, administrative pressure and the agency. So those types of things, but we can do it.
Make the decision to do it.
Yes.
Leonard from Riverdale is on the phone. Hey, Leonard, how are you?
Hi, Gary. How are you?
I'm fine.
I had an experience in December which certainly illustrates the lack of training for the TSI people. I have a implanted defibrillator.
Okay.
And this woman insisted I go through the scanner, which I can't go through. And I had to demand a supervisor to come over and tell her that I have to be patted down. If this is the type of training they get, what security do we have?
It's a really good question, and you've really underscored exactly what. Thank you so much for calling. You've underscored what Mr. Timon is saying. They should be trained, every person working, so that if someone like Leonard walks by and says, "This is my situation," that they know how to deal with it.
Sure.
And
you cannot be, you have to have a certain degree of flexibility when you're doing your job, because we're dealing with people here. We're not dealing with objects, and we have to use your common sense, as you said, because you can see a situation, you can assess, but unfortunately here the system don't want to let you think. You have to do your job systematically, no questions asked. Everybody should go through the same process, and this is what results in people, like the gentleman or the lady that called, being held without any further explanation. Mm-hmm. And they, and for me as a passenger, I travel a lot. I won't mind, going through all the questioning in the world, all the searches that they want to do. But I'm thinking about my parents. They're like in their 80s now. How hard is that for them? How hard is that make their travels? And we're not talking about people that are having any issues. They just want to travel from point A to point B. Right. This is all they're doing. And with this type of training, we're actually making people more less tolerant for the authorities, and more anti. Yeah. Yeah.
So someone like Leonard, who says, "Look, I'm just telling you what has to be, but you work with me here. I'm not carrying anything I shouldn't be carrying." Do you see things when you travel? Do you say, "Gee whiz, look at that"? I'm sure you do.
That's my job. I do it all 24 hours a day. Everywhere I go, I assess, and this is how what makes people think, or makes people of my sort think about problems and how to create solutions. Because if I'm thinking about only how to create a problem, I'm not a part of the solution. I want to have a solution how to solve those problems, and I see a lot of problems throughout the world in many areas of the world that.
Gentlemen, we're essentially out of time. Professor Wilfred Pinckney, congratulations on your new position at Monroe College.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. And Albert Timon, thank you so much for
having us.
joining us. And folks, if you have comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at BronxTalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future program. You can see archives of Bronx Talk at blip.tv. Just search for Bronx Talk. So we'll see you next Monday night, and every Monday night at 9 for Bronx Talk here on Cablevision Channel 67 and Verizon Fios 33.